Welcome to the Snapshots podcast, hosted and run by the Global Health Working Group as part of the British International Studies Association. This podcast gathers the personal insights and interests of global health researchers through conversations with those at its cutting edge. My name is Christopher Long, co-convenor of the BISA Global Health Working Group, lecturer in international relations at Queen's University Belfast, and the host and production manager of this podcast. This episode, we are speaking with Suzanne Hindmarch, Associate Professor at the University of New Brunswick. Hi, Suzanne, and thank you so much for taking part in the Snapshots podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, great. It's great to have you here. So to begin with then, what sparks your interest in global health?
So my interest in global health actually began with community health and with very local work. Throughout my undergraduate degree in Edmonton, Alberta, which is a province in Canada, I was doing community-based HIV and AIDS work. So I was doing this work at a time when people were still dying of AIDS. They weren't living with HIV. So it was a time just as antiretrovirals were in the early stages of development. And in my community, it was also a time when the demographics of the disease were shifting from primarily young gay men who had been sort of the animating force who had developed these community-based AIDS organizations to a much more diverse and in many ways a much more structurally disadvantaged population. So Indigenous peoples, people using injecting drugs, sex workers, and then later on, more recent migrants, immigrants. So more diverse and more disadvantaged populations. So I was doing that work, and I was also doing my undergraduate degree in political science at the University of Alberta, and I was focused on international relations and global issues. And there was just a lack of connection between what I was seeing in the community and the community-based AIDS organizing that I was doing and what I was being taught at that time. Really, health was absolutely not seen as part of global politics and international relations. So I became interested in the politics of HIV and AIDS from that very local community level, and then obviously became more aware of and learned more about the global dimensions of the global pandemic and which regions, which populations globally were most affected by it. So that really was what animated my initial interest in global health, and then trying to fit my interest in HIV and infectious disease into a political science framework that at the time, at least where I was studying, really didn't consider health a political issue.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, very interesting. Yeah, I think your story, yeah, chimes a lot with a lot of the other people we've had on the podcast talking about the way that health has emerged as a new political concern over time for sure. So what are some of the most important issues and questions that you've investigated in this area of global health?
Well, I would say broadly speaking, I have two, maybe three sort of overarching research interests. One is around priority setting. So understanding there are a lot of political challenges, generally speaking, and within the realm of global health, there are a lot of health and disease related challenges and issues. So how and why do some of those issues, like HIV, for example, rise to the top of the policy and political agenda? How do politicians and policymakers come to understand some health issues as problems? So what are the sense-making processes that go into that in terms of determining priorities, but also in determining what sort of priority or problem is this issue? So is this a health security issue? Is this a human rights issue? So that's one piece, the priority setting. The second is around equity, and especially around structurally marginalized, equity deserving, equity denied groups who are, as I think, I hope the audience for this podcast would know, are most, disproportionately impacted by all sorts of chronic and infectious disease, and often have more limited access to resources, more limited ability to access systems and health structures that are both accessible, affordable, culturally competent, and welcoming. So I'm interested in the interplay between those. So how do we frame health issues as a security threat or as a human rights issue? And then what are the impact of, or what are the implications of that for equity deserving populations who are often most impacted by health and disease issues? And then at the largest level, I would say I'm kind of interested in how we live together as political
Mm.
communities. And
Yeah.
that's, in and beyond the realm of global health.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I saw one of your books looks at the HIV/AIDS pandemic and securitization, I think, and that's some of the one of the ways you've looked at that. Is there any particular issues that draw you to this area, or anything that draws you in particular to
Yes.
investigating these topics?
Yeah, well, as I said, part of that
Yeah.
was about sort of personal history and coming to global health, not as a scholar, not as someone who was initially driven by theoretical questions or by an academic interest, but someone who was interested in this from the community perspective. And I think especially in terms of that first book about securitization and HIV/AIDS, and especially this series of Security Council debates starting in 2000 about AIDS as a security threat, which was at that time, that was the first time that the UN Security Council had ever discussed a disease as a threat to security. They had typically focused on security in more traditional national security terms. So what drew me to that in particular was this disconnect that
Mm.
in the community-based organizations that I was working with, folks were not talking about HIV as a security threat. They were talking about it as a human rights issue, as a gender justice issue, as a racial issue, as an issue of colonialism, and all of these structural drivers of the pandemic. So I was initially just really motivated by wanting to understand why did these very powerful people, or at least what seemed to me at the time to be very powerful people in the UN Security Council and the UN system, why were they talking about HIV and AIDS as a security threat when the people I was working with who were very deeply involved in this at a grassroots level were not? So how did it come to be on the UN Security Council agenda?
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that was a very specific question,
Yeah.
but underpinning that very specific question was that question about how grassroots and community-based um, work, activists, entities, organizations do or do not engage with or get engaged with these more the structures and systems of formal global politics. What we're often taught in international relations courses are where global politics and global health really happens.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, and yeah, you touch on very interesting areas of your research, and then also some of the key questions that you're kind of interested in investigating, and yeah, the disconnect between actually what you experienced at the kind of community level, and then the way it's portrayed in international politics, and then maybe at higher levels of political systems, have you seen, and as you mentioned in Alberta and
Mhm.
things like this. Yeah, yeah, it's really fascinating. Have you reflecting on your experience? What's been kind of some of the biggest surprises in your understanding of global health from when you first entered? I mean, I guess you mentioned you touched on some of these issues, right, about the surprise and yeah, the disconnect. But has there been any others? And
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that really surprised me is the extent to which what often drives priority setting is not evidence. It's stories,
mm,
it's narratives, and it's often much more personal perception. So, for example, interviewing folks about, why did you put HIV, like why were you working to get HIV on the Security Council agenda? And this is something that I write about in the book. Peter Piot said, well, my preoccupation was just how to get more money
mm,
for HIV and AIDS. And it seemed like this was security was the powerful place in the UN system. It was that is that if you invoke security, if you invoke this powerful idea of threat, and if you bring in these very powerful players at the UN Security Council, that's going to move your issue to the top of the political agenda, which is consistent with what securitization theory sort of tells us
Yep.
to expect. But it wasn't about having done this carefully constructed theoretical or research or evidence-based process. It was about looking at the practical politics of
Mm.
the UN system and trying to determine where power was located,
Yeah.
and then framing an issue in a way that would open some doors. So that was a bit of a surprise. And I found that also. So I also worked for the Public Health Agency of Canada
Mm.
before I completed and while I was completing my PhD. And I also found there that one of the health ministers was very, very focused on, and one of the issues that she cared deeply about was domestic violence,
Mm.
was family violence. And so in the public health agency, when the minister determined that that was going to be one of her priorities, then we went out and started finding research and building the business case for why domestic violence is a health issue. And it absolutely
Mm.
is.
Hmm.
The evidence is there, a case is there, but it was the personal priority and also the personal experiences of that particular minister that is what made that a political priority. So that I think we think of health as being, this pretty sciencey thing, this realm of politics that ideally, in principle, should be driven by evidence. And often we think about that as being driven by scientific and biomedical evidence, and it's not. It's driven by politics. It's driven by the stuff that we study and do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I guess in the two examples you mentioned, yeah, it's the priorities of the power of security and gaining resources, and then the maybe not completely, but like the sort of personal priorities of those who are, yeah, in power at the time and how you navigate these things. Yeah, that's really
Mhm.
fascinating as kind of a disconnect or yeah, something I guess you learn quite powerfully and quickly working in the field. Yeah. You mentioned securitization theory. I mean, yeah, are there some other very interesting and powerful theories, or has securitization theory been kind of the most important one you've used in your work? And
Yeah,
what's the role of theory in your work? Yeah.
so I would say am very theoretically driven, although
Hmm.
my interest in global health and disease and in both HIV and antimicrobial resistance came about through practice. The type of questions that I find intellectually engaging are quite theoretically driven. So I'm
Hmm.
interested in how we can use theory to better make sense of the world around us. So I have and continue to use securitization theory. I think it is a very powerful theory, particularly because it helps us study and it offers what to me is a very persuasive account of power
Mm.
and of the ways that invoking security, and especially when security is invoked by senior political figures and leaders in bureaucratic structures, the way that that can work to concentrate power, to centralize power, and to circumvent what we consider to be normal, quote unquote, normal political processes. So I know securitization theory has come under fire in recent years. It's been critiqued for that sharp distinction between normal and exceptional politics. It's been
Mm.
critiqued for being Eurocentric in some of those claims. And there is maybe some merit to those claims, but I do think it still is a very, very persuasive account to me of how those practical security politics happen, and
Mm.
especially of some of the dangers, some of the risks of securitization. So I do find that a very useful theory to work with, but I also find that helps me at least identify problems
Mm.
and the dangers and the risks of using security as a frame when we're talking about health and disease and why uh, health issues or specific diseases should be a political priority.
Yeah.
Where I find it less useful, though, and where I think some of my more recent work is taking me, is to the more reconstructive side of, okay, so what? So what are some better alternatives? And there I've really been drawn to theoretical accounts of relationality, and this gets to some of my core interests in how we live together as a
Hmm.
political community.
Yeah.
So some of that, especially in a Canadian context where colonization, decolonization, and the politics of indigeneity are really front of mind for a lot of us working in the academy right now. So
Yeah.
some of that has been thinking with and through Indigenous scholars, First Nations,
Hmm.
Métis, Inuit scholars in Canada and Indigenous scholars elsewhere. But there's also a much deeper, longer theoretical tradition that comes from feminist thought, from critical race theory, the ethics of care. So I'm really interested in exploring those questions about relationality and how we might build more equitable and transformative power relations. So that's where I would say some of my newest work is grounded or is heading.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So you mentioned yeah, some of this new work. So what do you think are some of the most important issues within the field of global health and that you think need investigating?
Well, I mean, my current work is focused on antimicrobial
Mm,
resistance, which I find fascinating because it's not a single thing in the way that HIV it is a single virus.
mm,
For example, although the structural drivers of it are very complex, antimicrobial resistance is something that cuts across all infectious diseases, fungal infections. This process of the microbial world speaking back, fighting back, becoming resistant to
mm,
antibiotic and other treatments, I think is fascinating, very complex theoretically, very complex in terms of practical politics. And so perhaps because that's my core area of study right now, I'm also inclined to say that I think that is one of the most important global health issues of our time
mm,
because it's going to impact all of us. But it's also going to impact structurally marginalized populations the most, the people who
mm,
can't afford the second or third or fourth line antibiotics that are scarcer, that are often, more expensive, often require more difficult courses of treatment, longer courses of treatment. So it's going to have an impact on those populations, and those are groups that are already most adversely affected or most disproportionately affected by some of the diseases like tuberculosis, where we're seeing high rates of resistance. So that is one piece, but then I also think that just generally speaking, the larger context within which health and disease unfold. So the larger context of the climate crisis, the climate emergency, the larger context of political economies. I'm thinking for example, my colleague Kelly Lee, who has done work on the commercial determinants of
mm.
health, on
Yeah.
how the food that we eat, these systems of agribusiness and industrial food production impact our health. So I think these sort of larger contextual pieces that impact health, but that often are driven by policy and political choices that are outside of ministries of health or the World Health Organization or the health sector, and how we bring those together. How do we meaningfully address some of those much bigger contextual environmental issues and processes within which we are or are not healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very fascinating. I think, yeah, the topics you mentioned, AMR, and also, yeah, the environmental determinants of health as well, all speak to how interconnected we are, and as you mentioned, how we live together, right? Not with just
Mhm.
with it, not with other humans, but also with animals and the natural environment and the interactions, which, as we know, yeah, the animal sector is huge for antibiotic use and things like that. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think that also points to the the importance of theory.
yeah,
What theories, what theoretical approaches can help us make sense of these really complex relationships and politics and the human and more than human world,
yeah,
which again I think is why I'm drawn to theories that examine and really help us understand relationality
yeah.
and how we situate ourselves in this very complex set of politics and relations.
Yeah, definitely. Have you looked at any of those theories in particular, or is there any ones that you're excited to investigate, or?
Well, so the most recent article that I published was using Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology, and I
Oh,
find
cool.
that it was an article that engaged with her work, her queer phenomenology, but also trying to knit that together with and bring that into conversation with some other theorists like Chandra Mohanty and some other Indigenous theorists, people like Kim Tallbear,
Mm,
because they are talking about relationality, but they are also theorizing and writing about the spatial relations involved and the temporal relations
mm,
involved in and just relations of proximity and distance, which
yeah.
again I'm interested in because of what often seems like a lot of distance and
Hmm.
disconnect between the community or communities at the grassroots. Where we often see the most adverse impacts, but also some of the most promising responses
Hmm.
to health issues and infectious disease, and then the sort of formal global political structures
Yeah.
where a lot of decisions are being made that impact those communities at a distance.
Yeah. Really? Oh, wow. That's really fascinating. Yeah. Very interesting. Great. And what advice would you give to students thinking about trying to enter the area of global health as a field of study?
So I have a lot of advice
Yeah. Oh,
here.
great.
I can't
Fantastic.
promise that
Yeah.
it's good advice, but
Yeah.
it's based on my own experiences. I think one would be to think about where the global is.
Mm,
And we often, especially as scholars in the global north, North America, Europe, imagine or are led to imagine global health as being something that happens elsewhere.
mm,
Maybe in Geneva in the World Health Organization, but often in the global south, in low and middle income countries. So I would encourage first, think about the global at home and about local health issues and politics as being part of the global and imbricated in
mm,
global processes that shape health and disease outcomes. So I suggest that in part, for pragmatic reasons, and in part because of normative and ethical reasons related to doing overseas field research around global health, especially if you're early in your academic or scholarly trajectory.
yeah.
The other, I think, that is very important is pick up a skill. As much as I love theory and theoretical debates and the type of work that, and I think, Chris, the type of work that you do as well, that is very theoretically rich as well
Thank you.
as empirically driven, but pick up a skill, whether that's program evaluation, whether that's a
Mm,
language, whether that's having a particular quantitative or qualitative data analysis technique, because that is something that you can take to community organizations or to
mm,
NGOs or to government if you aspire to a career in global health outside of academia. And it is also, unfortunately, the reality of academia is, and this is just basic arithmetic, there are more folks graduating with PhDs in political science and global health related disciplines than there are academic positions
mm,
available. So it's also very important to have other options available to you, and doing that skills building ensures that if even if you do hope to have an academic career, if that doesn't work out, you have something else that you can do and that you can plausibly say to employers outside of the academy that you have meaningful skills
mm,
to offer.
yeah.
And then the final piece of advice I would have, especially because I've been talking to a lot of undergraduates and students completing their master's degree, are often really, really I would say almost sometimes sort of paralyzed by fear and indecision. That if you choose one thing, if you choose to go on to grad school or if you choose to work in an NGO as opposed to government, that door is going to be closed forever, and that is not the
Mm,
case. I myself took a very circuitous route into the academy. I worked in community-based organizations. I went back to do my master's degree. I worked in the federal government. I did some overseas development work. I went back to do my PhD. And I say that just because even if you choose not to go on to a PhD right away, or you choose not to pick up a government job or an NGO or a private sector job right away, does not mean that you're closing that door
Mm.
forever.
Yeah.
So it's okay to
Mm.
make a choice and decide that whatever avenue you've pursued is not the one that you want to pursue. Other doors and other paths will still continue to be open to you because global health is such a rich, diverse field. There are so many options and opportunities out there for anyone who's studying in this field.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic advice, I think. And I think all the issues that you mentioned that you focusing on your future research and also that have already happened are just going to increase the importance, I think, maybe of the field and yeah, its importance in politics, I think, maybe global politics.
Um,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
think especially because it is a very dynamic
Mm.
field that there's the sort of base reality of how disease happens,
Yeah.
of how infectious disease, for example, is transmitted, although even there, with antimicrobial resistance, the dynamics of how we diagnose and how we treat infections is changing. But beyond that sort of basic materiality of, we know what most cancer-causing chemicals are, although there's
Mm.
still a lot scientifically we don't know about
Yeah.
what exactly causes cancer in some bodies, but not others. There's a lot we
Yeah.
don't know on the science side.
Hmm.
But there's also then the politics
Yeah.
involved in even where we have scientific and medical certainty, how do we get medical treatments
Yeah.
to the people who need them? How do we ensure that resources are more equitably distributed? And how do we get upstream to tackle some of those structural drivers of health and disease so that people are not becoming ill with preventable diseases to begin with?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Very important questions. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that brings our conversation to a close.
Okay.
I'd say thank you so much, Suzanne, for taking part in the Snapshots podcast.
You're very welcome. Thank you again for inviting me.
Great. Great to have you on. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Snapshots podcast. Please see the show notes for more information on our guest.